Anyhow, would you pull the door? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Moving on, this wonderful day. And I think you all know that our next speaker is the person who has put this meeting together and put a life into Bowen theory. And we'll get a chance to see it, but I have my late night musings again that she doesn't know about. But that Wynton Marsalis's evening with 60 Minutes inspired me in many ways. One of the comments that one of his colleagues had on 60 Minutes in talking about this man's excellence in his knowledge of the fields of music and history and all kinds of areas that related to life. And he said, of course his music is exceptional. And he said about him, he works harder than anybody. he works harder than anybody I know, even though he's among the best. And I thought about our two speakers today, but I've watched Victoria Harrison work harder to always do better in her work and in her life. And it is an inspiration, and I'm very glad to be around it. So today is her day to keep going. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Rossio. I really appreciate being known as someone who works hard to do better. And one of the motivations for that for me is always falling short of how well I'd like to do. And I'm sure this will be another of those days. I'm going to work from here because the clicker is unreliable from the stage on the PC. I've watched, and it's less reliable. So I'm here where I can punch my buttons here and move through my overheads. I apologize for blocking them to some extent. You can read on your program that the topic I chose to work on for today is family systems science. Family systems and science in clinical practice and research. And this email reached my box this morning, and I thought I would start with it. One of the purposes for selecting the topic of science and family systems is that it is the least popular in my observation. It's the least popular aspect of Bowen theory. In fact, I've had people who are students of Bowen theory say clergy aren't interested in science, you can't talk about science, and keep the interest of clergy, they glaze over. They want to hear about relationships. Well, science is about relationships. And I'm going to try today, one of my goals for myself, as I struggle with this, is to present a history, mine, of ways that science and Bowen theory have both been so relevant to the efforts I made to work on differentiation of self as a person in my own family, in clinical practice, and in the field of Bowen theory work. And then this email arrives about the absence of scientific literacy in a study done by Michigan State University and the impact of that. This one article has documented or described how the lack of understanding of the carbon cycle produces the inability to understand the impact of global warming for college students. And I'd say that lack of science has an impact, and the knowledge that can be provided through science and the effort to be scientific about relationships and emotional process that the absence of science also has an impact on not understanding human relations and human behavior, whether it's one's own nature or that of others. So I'm going to give an example of my own efforts and where they've led and the difference it has made to include science as part of the study of family systems, and the difference it has made, knowing that it is just one person's story. If anybody wants this email, let me know. I can forward it to you. But let me shift to my presentation. Good. I'm going to see how far I can get with this clicker and not have to stand right in front of you all on the screen. Not very far. Although before I became a teen bride and subject to the science of reproduction as a 16-year-old. Now, that's an example. Had I known a little more science, or believe it, my life would have been different. And I wanted to be a vet. So I worked at the vets, I watched animal behavior. My favorite teacher was the naturalist in Stanford Elementary School. But once I conceived, married, and had to make a living, I headed off into education and teaching. And really, it was when I began to study in the postgraduate program at the Bowen Center at Georgetown in 1975 that Dr. Bowen's conviction about the importance of science and his description of how he integrated science in his own way in the study of human behavior and families reignited what was a fascination for me in the natural sciences. I'm going to begin talking first about Bowen's observations and some of his teaching about the importance of science. If you have read The Odyssey Towards Science, the epilogue in Dr. Kerr's book, Family Evaluation, then you've read this for yourself, and you know that Dr. Bowen, as he began to observe the process of human behavior, at first as a student of psychiatry at the Menninger Institute, and then later in his research project that Jack Butler described yesterday, Dr. Bowen referred to the natural sciences for concepts and for language that helped him place his observations of human behavior and the human family in the context of the natural sciences, instead of in the context of literature, Proust, or Jane Austen, or some of the greats, or Shakespeare, some of the greats, or John Milton. Dr. Bowen chose to integrate his observations and get his head going in the direction of the natural sciences. Now, I've just begun reading Eric Kandel's autobiography and history of the science of history of neuroscience, and learned that in the context of the study of the cell and the study of the neuron in particular, there were many who were aiming their thinking and research toward a science of human behavior that predate Freud. And that Dr. Bowen actually is in a long tradition of people who had to move from the absence of science toward a scientific or a science of human behavior. And I realized as I was preparing this presentation today that I think Dr. Bowen's name also belongs not only in the important theories and theoretical developments of human civilization, but he also belongs in the history of neuroscience. And I'll talk some about that toward the end of my talk today. was very fortunate to be in the postgraduate program at the time I was. By 1980, Dr. Bowen began to outline the steps he had taken to move his head toward natural systems. And that included his professors, classes he took, how he approached his educational process, what he was reading, how he went about seeing systems when those around him were seeing the individual. And I listened up, looking for footsteps to follow. And he and Dr. Kerr are scientists and thinkers whose efforts certainly influenced mine. And I would say I, like many early students, were simply looking for the next step to take right in the steps that they had led. And I would be taking what I thought were steps, following in Dr. Bowen's footsteps or following in Dr. Kerr's footsteps. And all of a sudden I'd find myself wandering off over here in my own direction. And in the course of that, stumbled upon Wendell Berry's poem, the Mad Farmer's Manifesto, in which he said, "Be like the fox, make many steps, some in the right direction." And I began to realize that anybody who was working on differentiation of self, working on understanding the phenomenon from a systems point of view, was going to be making many steps, some in the wrong direction, some in the right direction, that it is a process of trial and error learning, not a process of following the directions that someone else leads in a copycat fashion. That inevitable in learning is learning for yourself. I have a friend who's one of the most successful contemporary artists, and he knows that my husband and I collect self-taught art, and he has said again and again when he's teaching and talking and referring to the process of art, Jack Massey says, all art is self-taught. All science, maybe to some extent, self-learned. And Dr. Bowen would emphasize in his classes and in the postgraduate program the direction he took toward the natural sciences. That his focus on reading, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, psychology, he didn't rule them out, but he added to that sociology, anthropology, ethology, physiology, biology, social work, religions, physics, botany, chemistry, the sciences, that could provide a framework of knowledge, but also about a process of discovering ways to recognize fact and separate fact from subjectivity and feeling states. And some of the guidelines that, some of the take-home lessons, some of the steps that I learned or decided to follow included studying something of my own, in my own family, but also outside my own family. Study something in the human phenomenon. Become a better observer, as Dr. Kerr illustrated and described today. Find ways to distinguish facts from feelings and reactions. Not an easy project. Fact is not a four-letter word. Well, it is, but it is not forbidden, as some would say. It has involved examining and defining my own beliefs and examining their origins, recognizing assumptions that I'm making. To this day, that process continues to humble and inform me how quickly I can shift to an individual cause and effect way of thinking about myself, my marriage, my grandchildren. And then to define principles and operating principles to follow in personal life, clinical practice, trying to do research, trying to write. For me, observing not only when I am able to employ a principle, but when I fail. Under what conditions will I fail to apply or live by a principle that has been well thought out and defined and validated? And it happens. It happened yesterday. Some of the directions that I've taken in the effort to practice the steps that make sense to me and that Dr. Bowen, Dr. Kerr, and other faculty outline in the postgraduate program as ways to work on science and Bowen theory, and myself have included, well, first I'm going to go through 3 areas, and I'm going to have to start rush through 3 areas. You're not going to get to see the data on these research projects. They've been presented, some of them have been published, so you can look at that later. But my first foray, really, was into the study of stress and health, stress biology and health and family systems. Needless to say, it was motivated by my own family and the experience of significant physical symptoms in my mother and in others in my own family. And I became and in myself, I became very interested in how to understand the ways that relationships govern physiological reactivity, as well as how we feel, how we behave, our relationship process itself, distance, closeness. But it made sense to me early on in studying at the Bowen Center that relationship process also governed the physiological levels of reactivity that I could see in my mother's blood sugar insulin levels and that I could see in my own asthma and later began to see in my own fingertip temperature. So the opportunity was provided for me to use biofeedback instruments to allow science to be more up close and personal. That Dr. Bowen was interested in using biofeedback instruments, and I think it was 1977. He encouraged Lillian Rosenbaum and other faculty to incorporate the use of biofeedback instruments for the study of some aspects of physiological reactivity in the context of family systems. And I was third in line to get on the equipment and to begin to use it to see what were the ways I was reacting to my life, to family members, and in a very clumsy and rudimentary way began to put together some knowledge about physiological reactivity from observing my own, and then later from reading in the sciences about measures of stress reactivity, which of course, if you follow the field from the 1950s to 2011, you know that it is a rich and complex field, not a simplistic on-off phenomenon. It's not just a matter of some stress, or stress yes, stress no. It's a matter of stress how long, and in what systems, and how does it influence. Biofeedback instruments provide, the ones that I use, provide an opportunity to observe fingertip temperature as a measure of, indirect measure of sympathetic nervous system activity and vagal activity. It lets you, 12 minutes. It allows you to see skin sweat response, adrenaline level, excitement, fear, anger. It lets you see skeletal muscle tension and somatic activity, each of which is far more complex than I thought in 1977 when I began to first observe physiological reactivity. You will read in the book, the collection, the new collection of papers called Bringing Systems Thinking to Life. You can read examples of my efforts to use knowledge from the sciences about stress reactivity in observing my own levels of reactivity, and that in my mother and father in the nuclear family triangle, and to put together a way of understanding the difference it made to my mother's labile blood sugar insulin levels when her daughter could be in contact but not taking so much responsibility for my mother's internal states. I was 2 when my mother was diagnosed with brittle juvenile diabetes and began to have very rock and roll blood sugar insulin levels, many insulin reactions, and which she was sure she could not see coming. So my mother relied heavily on my father, on her 3- and 4-year-old daughter, and her sister-in-law and mother's grandmother to take care of her, to be on this constant watchbirds. And I grew up with that level of responsibility for my mother's blood sugar insulin state. And one of my first efforts with Bowen theory, one of them, was to learn whether my mother could or could not see an insulin reaction coming and take responsibility for that for herself. That story and others are in the new collection. For me, those were examples of the importance of science. Science and stress reactivity plugged into understanding relationship process were part of what gave me the courage to not give my mother her orange juice before she even noticed that she was moving into an insulin reaction. There were ways in which understanding physiology, mine, hers, and humans, fueled the effort to work on that and to learn that relationships between people can also stabilize that physiology, that those relationships are disturbing. The second effort came around the study of reproductive biology and evolution. By 1980, I was convinced that there was so much more about human behavior and the ways that relationships between people influenced our biology, and I knew I didn't understand evolution and evolutionary science, and struck out in 1980 to study reproductive biology and to look at how relationships in the human family would govern our reproduction, when, where, and how we reproduce. I knew growing up in the country that relationships influenced animal reproduction and that people knew a lot about that. And I thought people would have nailed human reproduction. So I began to study with the Institute for Reproductive Medicine and Endocrinology in Houston, who generously granted me a 6-month sabbatical, and began to study some of what was known about the interaction between the stress system and the reproductive system. And it's still not done justice to what is not known in that arena. I was able to see that in a study of 50 women who had not reproduced, the position they held in the family correlated with the absence of reproduction for 47 of the 50, and that for the remaining 3, a very different functional position in their family correlated with their absence of reproduction. That, I did not have the ovulatory information for those 50 women, and I was just bugged to know if something as fundamental as ovulation played a part in the absence of reproduction. Of course, it's diagnosed frequently, but I wanted to see it in the process. I wanted to see it, see how it worked. So the Institute physicians and scientists allowed me to do a study of of ovulation in family systems, and that was a stunning experience. in which the delay in ovulation for most of the women in the 12-woman study, the delay in ovulation was the most common ovulatory pattern, and only one woman in the study was ovulating at what would have been considered the fertile time frame, at or around 14 days. The majority of women were delayed in ovulation, and it varied over the 3 months of the study. The 3 anovulatory women, women who didn't ovulate at all, were the women who were cut off and had the least contact with the fewest number of people in their family. That was a piece of research that quickly integrated into my clinical practice as I began to coach and work with women who were referred by the high-risk OB-GYN department at Georgetown for work with family systems and feedback in the effort to either understand or modify their infertility and fertility-related problems. And that too is a longer story for another day. But I began to very quickly be able to use the observations integrating the science of reproductive physiology with the science of stress and the relationship process that was useful to people in clinical practice, either dealing with infertility, understanding the origins of it in their own family and in their own physiology, and deciding I do not need to spend $40,000 on in vitro. I'm going to either adopt or I'm going to go make my contributions in other ways, which was one way it would go. Another way it would go is people would begin to make contact with more members of their family, begin to be able to deal with their mother or their stepmother or others in their family and ovulate, which was pretty stunning. I began to see that Bowen theory defines processes and fundamental characteristics of living systems that are different from the concepts and observations that Charles Darwin defined in his amazing theory of evolution, but that Dr. Bowen's understanding of emotional systems and the variation in levels of differentiation with various levels of fusion between people and within our physiology and brain actually can operate as forces in the process of natural selection and play a part in differential reproduction, which is a key aspect of evolution, human and otherwise. So I think Bowen theory has contributions to make to the natural sciences that have not yet been attained and are likely not to come from my hands, but from the hands of scientists who are in mainline science and can hear Bowen theory and the contributions it makes to research. I'm going to sweep through the study of research in neuroscience and begin first with some of the quotations from Murray Bowen that I would say anticipate the next 20 years of research in neuroscience. Dr. Bowen, from his observations of human behavior, family systems, and his readings in evolutionary biology and the science of his day, was able to conceptualize and make observations that actually anticipate a percentage of the fascinating research in the labs of Joe Ledoux and Jaak Panskap and Steve Porges and other scientists who are looking more at the system within the body. And Dr. Bowen was able to, if I could underscore this without losing the PowerPoint, I would underscore that Dr. Bowen saw that the emotional system also governs the forces and is part of the forces operating in relationship systems in a reciprocal fashion. That relationships influence the brain and physiology in ways we have not yet begun to understand. And the physiology and brain function play out and govern relationship process in ways we've not been able to yet fully research or understand. Clinical practice is one window to the ways in which clinical practice can be one window. But I will say if people rule out science from clinical practice and from their thinking, it's possible to be a Bowen theory practitioner and glaze over when the science word is spoken and miss the physiology that is occurring in the context of the family and the relationships. Dr. Bowen's observations about differentiation itself and the scale of differentiation, variability between fusion, between emotion and intellect within the person, and between people in the relationships is a concept that the sciences have not yet exploited or employed. And it is something that most of us who struggle our lives to understand and implement Bowen theory practice also fail to realize is occurring at the physiological as well as the neural level, and miss a volume of information that's available in personal applications. One does not have to have physical symptoms to have physiology. And there are a number of ways I've learned that self-observation, with and without neurofeedback and biofeedback equipment, can provide someone information about physiological reactivity in self and others, and make use of that knowledge to ask questions and try to learn and understand the world. You know, I'm going to practice what I preach and stop, knowing that there are some important slides referring to the sciences and the neurosciences that I'll just have to live without. Dr. Kerr has certainly done justice to them in the last 2 days. I'm going to scoot through and stop on. I'm teasing you. I'm going to stop as I started with 2 quotations from Dr. Bowen from the Odyssey. That we are the first form of life that's been able to observe the feeling process with the intellect. And I would say observe reactivity with the intellect. Dr. Bowen's conviction about this produced a methodology for doing this through working on differentiation of self that the neuroscientists lack. And so Joe Ledoux and Jaak Panksepp and John Allman and Steve Porges are much less confident, as cautious as Bowen is. The neuroscientists are far less confident in what we can do to develop the ability to be a more factual and objective form of life, and to use that knowledge to make a difference in our own reactivity. I think that is another of the contributions Bowen makes to the natural sciences, that his theory has produced a methodology that we can employ in our own lives and clinical practice that will make a difference, possibly, in the future of human evolution. Thank you. I now have is it a break now? This is the discussion. Good. We had a break. I look forward to Dr. Kerr's thinking and the chance to speak with him.
Yes, the plan is, one more time, Dr. Kerr and Mrs. Harrison can have their dialogue. We can listen, and then there will be time for all of you to join in.
Fuzziness off this for a while, but maybe we'll be okay. Maybe this is where you were in the room.
Yes, you know, Dr. Kerr knows I'm really interested in his thinking about the importance of science to the study of family systems, and any comments about my presentation are welcome. You know how far short it fell.
I thought combined with Louise's introduction, a very nice summary and overview of what you've been trying to do and pieces you've been trying to pull together. You asked me yesterday if I would make a few comments about the importance of science, and so what I decided to do was pull some things that I knew I had in my computer to quote from, and how much I covered. How much I cover, I don't want to take too much time, but I did want to start with something that I had a lot of fun with in a way that pertains to one of the last things you said. And some of you remember the author, Arthur Kessler. And among the many books he wrote, one was called The Ghost in the Machine. And that came out, I think, in maybe around 1970 or a little bit before. He'd written quite a few other books too, has since died. But one of the things, The Ghost in the Machine, he spent a lot of time talking about Paul MacLean's work and the interplay between thinking and emotion, which was becoming more and more focused on, I think, during that period. And he explained, how emotion could dominate thinking, and then it was evident in the way the world was going, and that if we didn't get this under better control, technology was going to do us in, and which could be right, I don't know, but and he thought what we need to do is find a drug that will help separate thinking and the feeling system, so that you could have access to thinking. Bowen once suggested that maybe this could be done with a computer. Just put it in a computer and let the computer decide, because it may be more reliable than the human mind. But anyway, I wrote a long, 2-page, way too long, presumptuous letter to Arthur Kessler, explaining how he came up with this concept of differentiation of self, and how people went about it, and how that could facilitate people using their thinking instead of the automatic reactions. I forget what else. I have the letter still somewhere. I also have his brief response. I think he was in England at that point. Basically, he wrote back and said, it's interesting, but we ain't got that kind of time.
Oh, that's fine.
So I don't know. I'll just maybe say a few things, quotes I pulled off. Because this whole area of science, one quote that, one of my favorite quotes, where I thought Bowen paralleled Murray Bowen's thinking and definition of science as closely as anything I had read, because everybody has a different definition of science to some extent. Is from John Bonner, and when I ran across this quote, and I was alerted to it by a colleague, Frank Giovi, I thought this is perfect, and we wound up getting John Bonner as a speaker at Georgetown, and he became a kind of a fixture in the Bowen Center network from then on. But this is his definition of science. Science is about things. It is about rocks, stars, atoms, and living beings. It is about all those things that surround us and which used to be called nature with a capital N. Furthermore, it is about the relation of things. Science is concerned with order. You said many of those same things, but I thought that was a nice, pithy definition. It's just about what is. A second quote, two things come from I bought a series of audio tapes from the teaching company about science. And it was, the speaker was a fellow named Principe, who is from, I think he's up at Brandeis. Could be wrong, but I think it's at Brandeis. But he just makes what I thought were useful distinctions between how human beings look at things. And one continuum he drew is that there is the external reality of the natural world at one end, and there's the human culture at the other end. And then at the end, the external reality of the natural world would be what we're trying to interpret, where human culture is the interpreter. And implicit in that is a problem, which we all know, but I thought it was nice to spell it out. And he goes on to make a distinction between what he calls triumphalism and social constructivism. And I found this one useful. That triumphalism would be the gradual and progressive dawning of scientific truths on humanity. And certainly that characterizes the Enlightenment period up to a point. And social constructivism would be that no natural world, independent of human perception, or the real interest of those who study nature, doesn't exist. And that's a fairly widespread view that's out there. So I thought it was useful to spell it out. Last two, this one's from a biological anthropologist, University of Lethbridge, which is up in Alberta. He says, "I'm not a big believer in insightful discovery or the aha moment in science, at least not as the kind of purely creative process it's sometimes taken to be. I think most of what are called discoveries already exist, really, in the dots of different disciplines that just need to be glimpsed by a single pair of eyes in order to be connected. You're never going to do anything other than create a dot or two with your own work if you don't step back to allow the broader patterns to pop out. In other words, it's pattern recognition all the way down." That's a man named Drew Randall. But the first quote I thought of when you asked me to comment on the importance of science is actually from Denis Diderot, the French Enlightenment figure, natural philosopher, I guess you could call him. "Nothing is more dangerous than to deceive ourselves about the world in which we find ourselves. We need an ethic of truth to coexist with nature." And that was 250 years ago. So beyond that, I thought what I was trying to capture up here and what you were talking about, what you've been trying to capture, fit together, and I don't think I have anything more to say about it at this point, but I appreciated the effort to focus on science. I know when I was a psychiatric resident, before I met Bowen, one of the, I forget who he was an interpersonal psychiatrist and a follower of Harry Stack Sullivan. And he got to talking about the possibility of the science of human behavior. And I was one who poo-pooed that idea. I said, how could you ever have science about something so incredibly complex as human behavior? Of course, I wound up coming full circle. I also said at that point that no one theory is enough. The key is eclecticism. And then I wound up being one theory. I guess the last story I'll say, I was in Council Bluffs, Iowa, doing a meeting about 4 or 5 years ago. And there were a bunch of students from the University of Omaha, and University of Nebraska at Omaha, who came to the conference. There were about a dozen. And they didn't say anything during the course of the day. And so at the end of the day, I said, well, you students, is there anybody here who wants to make a comment? You haven't said anything today. And so one young woman stood up and said, yes, I would. She said, these are family therapy program master's people. She says, in our program, we're taught it's all about eclecticism. You look at all the different viewpoints, and then you take points of view that make sense to you, and you go for it. And she said, Dr. Kerr, you seem to be a purist. And she said, I've never met a purist before. I took that as a compliment. But that's what I had done, because I did believe, it was implied by the 2 days, it would be this afternoon, that truly Bowen theory is an umbrella that's broader than all these other points of view in the family therapy world, many of which are very valid and very useful. But I do think they fit under this larger umbrella of Bowen theory. And of course, not only that, but as you were suggesting here, that Bowen theory can fit in some way with the broader development of systems, ideas, and all areas of knowledge. I'll stop with that.
Well, if I could, just a couple of comments. If I had if I had made better decisions about using the 30 minutes, I might have included the quotation from David Sloan Wilson. You've seen it, probably. It's on his website. And he is another of those scientists who's spoken at the Georgetown Family Center, at the Bowen Center, and maintained some connection, I think, to Bowen theory. And he described the process of science. He defined science as the process that you defined this morning in your clinical practice in working with Ms. Mager, that a process of defining hypotheses based on existing knowledge and then looking for observations that confirm or alter the hypothesis based on theory and existing knowledge. And David Sloan Wilson almost says that in his description of the scientific process and how it is not simply for the elite or the academic or the corporate funded scientist, that he's trying in his life and work to let people know that it's much more like bricklaying or quilt making. And it's something that ordinary people do when they're being thoughtful. And then the one other quote that I left out that I thought is appropriate, and the scientist's name I can't remember, but it's on the slide, that says, we don't have all the answers. That's science. And that is another of the realities of science that is important to me personally. As an oldest sister, asked to have all the answers for her mother and for others, it helps to know that I don't. And I have to have and organize for myself experiences in which I learn that I don't, and that nobody else does either, that it is a part of learning and contributing. So that's another way that science has been very helpful to me as a person and as a clinician, it's helped me overcome the illusion that I do have the answers for someone else. And I know I have not convinced you or anybody at the Bowen Center that I do. I'm not at risk of that around the Bowen Center. Or here, for that matter. And science helps. Thanks. Okay, Louisa.
Just one last, because you mentioned David Sloan Wilson, and this was kind of, again, a fun experience with him. Because the first time he came was one of the variation conferences, probably in the late 90s. And these conferences were developed by a group of 4 people, 1 based at the center and 3 out in the network, and to bring in people studying biology, behavior in other species. In particular interest is how do you understand variation within the members of other species and compare that with how Bowen theory has addressed individual variation. And Sloan Wilson came, and I think I had an early talk, maybe at the opening talk. And Sloan Wilson, David Sloan Wilson, became very well known for his interest in group selection as opposed to just individual selection, which it's a hotly debated area. Can natural selection operate on the group as a whole? Can it operate, if you got these unrelated individuals? And anyway, so I gave in my talk, borrowed a definition of the family from Bowen, which I thought you all, if you hadn't heard it, would appreciate hearing. Somebody in an offhand discussion said, well, Dr. Bowen, how would you define a family anyway? And he said, well, that's simple. He says it's the total number of individuals attached to an emotional nucleus. And that left room for genetic and non-genetic. And I remember Sloan Wilson got up and he said, that's crazy, Mickey. He said, even though he was interested in that, looking at the social process and how to make sense out of the social process, how did it evolve? But that became an oft-quoted definition of family. Because I think it does leave room for 3-generation families, 4-generation families, 1-parent families. It leaves room for other members of the community who become part of the family and have an emotional influence on it. You don't have to be confined to mother, father, and 2 kids or something like that. It's flexible enough to just back up and look who are all the individuals that are affected by this unit and who in turn affect the unit.
All right. The day goes on. Those of you who would like to bring your questions, I think that the ideas are wide open. So what's left with you to keep going?
Nothing very profound, I just have a specific question. Is there some place that I could find information from you, Ms. Harrison, on menstrual reactivity? Do you have data?
Mm-hmm.
And I could get it by email?
Yeah, please.
You mentioned it, but you didn't.
No, there was no time to
Okay.
present data from any of the studies, but yes, if you'll email me, I can pull copies or reprints and send you things.
Maybe I just couldn't. There's no one else in line. I'm very interested in this new buzz phrase that we have in medicine on, what are we calling it? Evidence-based medicine. I was always under the impression that we were operating on evidence-based medicine. So I'm curious what we mean by it now. And it looks very, very cause and effect, and it looks pretty tight too. Like a couple of people respond to something, and that's evidence-based. Do you all have any thoughts about this new thing, this new phenomenon?
let me hear what Dr. Kerr is thinking, and I'll put something in.
Maybe you'd want to speak to this too, because you're certainly an expert. I'll just make some few comments, but you probably know better than I. Part of what I think is behind that is an effort to make medicine more of a cookie cutter operation. And that to sort of, if you're doing this approach, you need to prove that this approach is effective. That's evidence-based medicine. And I know in psychiatry, even though it's often denied, more and more is a push toward if somebody has this diagnosis, you treat it in this way, and kind of stifles, I think, thinking rather than opening it up. But also there's a lot of fuzziness out there too. As Sir William Osler used to say, the famous physician at the turn of the century, if you come on a new therapeutic technique that's unusually effective, use it a lot and as quickly as you can before it loses its effectiveness. And there was an article in the New Yorker magazine.
We read that.
Okay, that suggested even many of these studies that's unexplained get very robust findings, but if you keep repeating the study over time, the robustness diminishes. Nobody can quite explain it. You know, that's one thought.
Good. Well, this is a good question and topic that I think others will pick up and address as the day goes on. I want to add that I've always been interested in outcome research. And I now know that outcome research is not the same as evidence-based research in therapy or medicine. But I think that I'm a practical-minded person, and that a good theory has practical applications and outcomes, and that it's very important to document those. I wish I did a better job of it. But I think that outcome observations can be part of the cycle of raising questions for continued research, and the variation in outcome is important to study and know and attempt to understand using theory and science. But I know that's not the same thing as evidence-based.
I think Dr. Kerr's comments are right. My perception in medicine in the last 20 plus years as a clinical investigator and a laboratory investigator is that there's a lot of anxiety in the world about their health. And this has driven the process to try to seek more certainty of, should I be doing this or not? There's some positive benefit from this because there hasn't been enough research. And research is really the core of how you improve anything, I think. It's like a form of self-assessment and looking at your mistakes as well as your successes. But evidence-based medicine is, the bad thing about it is it is, in some ways, seeking so much certainty at the exclusion of creativity. There's not going to ever probably be a randomized controlled trial for every disorder that one can conceive of. And some things are probably not studied best in that way. What Victoria just talked about with outcomes research is, one way is looking back at what happened meticulously, and there's a lot of benefit in that. But that's a post hoc study of an outcome, and there could be bias in what you're seeing, but you try not to be biased. The other problem is, if you do a randomized study, it's kind of like if you go to the parking lot, and if you wrote this down on a piece of paper, XYZ 789, and you walk out in the parking lot, and you're looking for an Alaskan set of plates. What's the odds you think you're going to see that here? Now, if you did, you'd go, wow. But if you saw that in the parking lot first, and then you wrote it down, That's the difference between a priori and post hoc, and that's why you've got to do a priori research. So I think both of these are, there's a tension with this, but I think we're overcompensated with some of the evidence-based medicine. It is a new, relatively new term, but it's a very important part of things if it's done, I think, properly. And that's with, basically knowing, you're never going to know everything in medicine. Never. Probably. So,
Thank you. Thanks.
I'd like to take advantage of the open season on questions. I saw a really good movie over the holidays called Temple Grandin. I really recommend it, very well acted. It's a true life story of a woman who grew up in the 60s with autism. And in those days, apparently the advice was to institutionalize her, but her mother was very committed to not doing that and trying to help her have a normal life. Well, this movie was about this young woman's life, and she ended up becoming she is a leading thinker in the field of animal husbandry and humane treatment of cattle. At any rate, as the movie was going on, the director did a really excellent job of trying to get into her head, and how she thought and processed things. And what stood out to me is that it seems to me that an autistic person is almost the opposite of what Bowen theory is seeking to address. She was an autistic person, as my rudimentary understanding is, has a overactive thinking mind and an inability to read emotion, to respond emotionally, and to read facial expressions and body language. And so I was wondering, it made me think, has anyone in Bowen theory ever thought about autism and this kind of reverse relationship that it actually seems to sort of demonstrate? For either one.
Well, I got interested in autism because somebody thought back in I guess it goes back to 7 or 8 years ago, that a meeting that involved Temple Grandin and myself would be interesting. And so this was held in Syracuse, New York. And so at that point, I'd had a few ideas about autism, and I knew what Bowen had made some comments about autism too, and family process. So I made it my business to try to learn something before this meeting. And I didn't learn enough before the meeting to do it as well as I would have liked to have done it, and kept trying, and have done meetings since that have, I think, worked rather well without, the conclusion I came to before the meeting, that I found it impossible to say where family emotional process ended and autism begins. And many people in families with autistic young adults or older, that idea makes sense to them. They sort of realize that it's kind of hard to separate sometimes. What's the family problem here that's playing out in this youngster? And what is autism anyway? I just thought the boundary becomes very, very blurred. When we got to the meeting, I can go on and on about this, but they were selling my book, and among others, and Temple Grandin picked up my book, and she looked at the book and she said, "This is all about theory." She says, "I don't do theory." But we really had a fun set of interactions. I'd love to talk about it another time. But I think your other idea is an interesting one. I mean, one view is that autism is a result of a brain disorder, and it's a distinct pathological entity, and that view has been in place since the 1960s. For a while there, it was seen more as a developmental thing. From the first time it was written about in the 1940s. I mean, there have always been different views up until about the 1960s. And then came the thought, we're being too hard on the parents of autistic kids as if they're causing this. And the pendulum, I think, swung. But I have thought along the lines that you raised that, and I don't know that if it's accurate, at one end of the continuum, you have autism. At the other end of the continuum, you have what you might call volcanic, histrionic emotionality. To me, both ends of that continuum are equally reactive. And I would put differentiation in the middle. Because many people have autistic qualities, thank God. And many people have more histrionic qualities, thank God. The world needs both, I believe. And they typically marry each other. I've read all of Temple's books, and I read the book her mother wrote about the family. And because I've made quite an intensive study of that. In fact, when I did that meeting, my hope was that I could interview Temple and her mother to talk about their relationship. They didn't want to go there. They've been there, sort of done that, and they're pretty convinced of how they're each looking at this. But I forgot what I was going to say related to that. But I think that idea is, it was Temple said, she made it very clear that her core deficit is she doesn't have a self. And she said, I know that because if I tried to get involved with somebody, I would be so lost and overtaken by the relationship, I couldn't function. So she says, I don't do that. But she has then gone on to have an extraordinarily productive life, as you point out. And I don't know much about the relationship between her and her mother. But Temple did say, I think in one of her books, Emergence, she said, if I did marry, I'd marry another autistic, because that way we would have very limited expectations of each other and we could make it work. I thought that was a beautiful statement. But thanks for raising the issue. I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's a very interesting area. Bowen thought perhaps it represents the most intense form of symbiosis because it's in place so early, like from age 2 or whenever it gets identified. And of course, these families wind up literally in orbit around these kids and trying to meet their needs. Some do far better with it than others, which I think has a lot to do with how it plays out. Anyway, the autism meetings I've gone to, the principal worry is, good God, how can these mothers survive this? They're so involved in trying to help these kids. They're wearing themselves out. How can we help these mothers? That's why they invited me. And one of the things that came up at one of the meetings I did, I talked about over-functioning and under-functioning. And not the origins of autism, but just how Bowen theory could be applied to looking at the family. And everybody warmed up to that. And then people were asking me, well, if you're an over-functioner, okay, I get it. What do I do about it? So rather than me trying to answer that, I asked, is there anybody in the audience that can help with this? Quite a few people stood up. Will you do this and this and this? It was kind of fun. I just kind of stayed out. And one woman said, Dr. Kerr, when I listen to you, it almost sounds like you're blaming the family. And she says, I know you're not, but I'm confused. It was one of the best presentations I ever did.
Sarah, do you want to chime in?
Let's go on to hear other
Okay.
questions. I'll
Okay.
come back to it.
Okay.
There's that.
I don't have a question, but a comment. Dr. Kerr and Ms. Harrison, I'm new to Bowen theory relatively, and I was unaware that the science part of Dr. Bowen's theory is one of the less popular parts of it. And I wanted to express my appreciation to both of you for keeping that very much alive, and just to share my experience of how useful that part of the theory has been to me already in noticing my physiological responses. I believe that that has been more accurate for seeing my own reactivity than my subjective experience of my reactivity. For example, I recently had an interaction with a person that I've had a long-term reactive relationship with, and my perception was that things were going very well. I wasn't feeling irritable, I didn't hear myself snapping at the other person, she wasn't snapping at me, and on and on. And yet I had this tremendous physical reaction. And that shows me that in spite of my subjective experience of less reactivity, my body is telling me that I have a long way to go. And I've been in therapy before, and also been in the church for many years. And I've never had anyone help me connect in quite this, well, no, that's not true. I took a mindfulness class this summer. And that was the first time that someone helped me intentionally connect my subjective experience, my emotions, my thoughts with my physical body. But this is the first time in therapy that I've experienced that. And it has been one of the most valuable tools for me. So I just want to thank you and share that experience with anyone else here. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your comments, and especially that you could put them in relation to other fields and other therapies. The history of psychotherapy as I know it, and there'd be many histories of psychotherapy, is that physical reactivity is often operates as invisible in most therapies. And when that body work, in quotes, has developed as a field separate from psychotherapy and medicine, there are people who practice body work. I'm thinking of, who's the German who built the argon box? No. Reich. Yes. Wilhelm Reich. I've been interested in body work for a long time. There's a fairly extensive field. But it operates cut off from and separate from understanding the relationship between thinking and emotional reactivity. Bowen theory, I think, permits a remarkable integration of knowledge from the study of biology, physiology, self-observation, and relationship process that I don't see existing in other fields of practice. I appreciate your comments about how that has been useful to you. I will still come back to the admonition from science and scientists that even drawing upon knowledge from many fields to connect dots in ways that are practical leaves us not knowing it all and never knowing enough. Never knowing enough to be as useful as one would like. But I don't know a better way. And I found myself telling my yoga teacher last week when I had a great yoga class, a yoga practice in which I could do very little, very few of the postures she was presenting to me to take. But goodness, there was so much energy after the class, and I realized that failing to do something that is inherently helpful is much better than not trying to do it at all. So I'm much more enthusiastic about trying and failing to integrate science, observation, and Bowen theory. I'm far more enthusiastic about failing at that than giving it up because I can't satisfy myself in the process. So thanks for your comments on it.
Dr. Kurt, you have a comment?
Well, I was just thinking it's better to have loved and lost and never loved at all.
I avoided that. I restrained myself.
Well, I think it related to the comment just made and some of the other things we've talked about. Many years ago, I was asked to be on a little news vignette for local TV in DC, and when I got it was going to be about 3 or 4 minutes, and we met ahead of time, the interviewer, and he said, I'm going to ask you what's the secret to good mental health. And for some reason, I came up with 3 things. One was make friends with your symptoms, which would be related to what you just brought up. Don't alienate your friends and family, and don't take yourself too seriously. But the making friends with your symptoms, I think, relates to the physiology. If you have a symptom that's chronic and not life-threatening, it can be one heck of a teacher. It's a built-in biofeedback if you believe that it reflects the ups and downs of chronic anxiety.
Yes.
Ms. Harrison, I want to thank you for what you did in the presentation. For me, was making it how clear that science and the use of science is practical, both in the personal realm and in the clinical work. And as I was thinking about it, part of what I want to thank the whole Bowen Center for is its ability to help me be more open to science, because I think my negative reaction to science was to the social science I was exposed to in a graduate study in psychology, where it seemed like the kinds of things that we were told to study or the research proposals didn't really seem to have any real utility other than getting published, or getting your doctorate. It didn't seem to connect with, I think what you said, Dr. Kerr, I think my first exposure to Bowen theory is, here is a theory big enough, an umbrella big enough. And so I think that effort towards connecting it with the natural sciences and with something practical, and not just about something that I think is connected to the questions about evidence-based. I mean, last year I was at a meeting of the Texas Psychological Association and listened to all the presentations, and the science of the woman who was, had been, is an acquaintance of mine and I listened to the research and said, it doesn't make any sense. It was all about discrimination and all kinds of blaming stuff that I see. So again, I appreciate what you did today, Ms. Harrison, and what the whole approach of Bowen theory, and keep on reminding us of the importance of science.
Dr. Barbella, thank you for that comment. It reminded me 2 things. One is that I've learned that I can learn things that I don't know or don't understand, like computers or the carbon cycle or, oh my goodness, soil chemistry. I can learn things that I don't understand if I can see its utility. If it's useful to me, if it fits into the puzzle I'm trying to piece together, then I can get my head to tolerate the migraines of learning endocrinology, for example. That would probably be one of my big milestones. But if I can't see the utility, then it's much harder for me to even remember what I've read. And that's the way my head works. I think some people can encompass far more new learning, maybe because they see how it fits a much bigger puzzle. Some people do a lot better than I have, but I need the utility piece myself. I need to see how it's going to fit and be useful to me. And it was helpful to hear you talk about the way that bias is in the research, or that the emotional, what I heard you say was that the emotional process in the research arena can be an obstacle to hearing. And that is something I hadn't thought about in that way. So, thank you.
Just a quick comment before you ask your question. I think it was 1606 Sir Francis Bacon wrote, the only important knowledge is useful knowledge.
What's,
Yeah, Bacon and Organon.
can I put in one more real quick? Another comment that I think, don't believe this is going to be quick, Mr. President. That the political process in research in science, medicine, mental health, the political process in the world of ideas is as emotional as the emotional process in family. That when we look at politics, I'd say, we're looking at societal emotional process. And that's it's been very helpful. Bowen theory has been helpful to me in thinking about the relationship and political process and trying to become a little more neutral in it. I'm not particularly renowned for that.
Ms. Richardson.
Okay.
Just as a follow-up example, then I promise to shut up. Because I think it captures it. Bernard Fisher at the University of Pittsburgh did research, this goes way back into the 70s, showing that lumpectomy was as successful in treating cancer as mastectomy, radical mastectomy for sure. I forget the exact details. He kept submitting this paper to the New England Journal, and I think maybe tried some other places, and it was being turned down for almost 10 years. Meanwhile, the medical profession is moving more and more in that period toward lumpectomy, even though the data hadn't been adequately published. But I think it did show that the emotional forces actually strongly affected the decision-making on publications of science.
Actually, what I was going to ask for your comment on is related to evidence-based medicine, particularly because I think it's part of societal emotional process that I think something is going on with the evidence-based research because a lot of it has to do with third-party payers, the economics and the politics, as opposed to the real evidence-based outcomes for the patients that we're actually trying to serve with that documented evidence. So that was.
And well stated. I think that you're right in many respects. And so thanks for stating it.
Ms. Richardson, I would just add that you are in a terrific position to know what you're talking about in that observation, and it would be interesting to see an article that you could write that illustrated what you just described.
I would love to do that. And you know, the funny part about it is most of the measures that are going on in medicine and hospital and with payment and whatever are all the Medicare regulations that are being given down to hospitals are in fact based on payment based on that evidence. And as an oncologist, you probably struggle with some of those things too, because sometimes what the evidence-based medicine is may not be right for an individual patient that you're trying to work with. So that creativity that we were talking about, or at least that judgment for you as a physician, is in many ways being impinged upon, I think, by the fact that somebody who probably doesn't know that much about things like the insurance companies is really making a lot of decisions about treatment and outcomes that may be based on evidence research, but there's something wrong in it.
Thank you so much. I think, any more? You had some additional, we've got, if there's anybody else, fine, but we've got about 5 minutes. Ms. Britt, we're going to move to the next question. Okay.
just to keep that conversation going, because I think about this a lot. A physician I work with in my little corner of the world wonder if it would not be more useful. His theory is to study well people rather than sick people. If you studied wellness, wouldn't you get more information? Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I just think, I don't know, I think Dr. Bowen wrote this down somewhere, not just remembering him say it, but he thought one of the things that constrained psychiatry in its development was too much focus on pathology. And he thought by focusing on the full range of human functioning, you're going to learn a lot more than just concentrating on one end. I mean, it's interesting because he saw things by studying the extreme families with schizophrenia and hardcore schizophrenia, but was quick to realize actually he's looking, at this broad range of functioning, and there's a great deal to be learned from what you said, I think.
Were there some things you wanted to pick up on from earlier, do you remember?
Well, there just isn't time. In this moment, in this meeting, there will be time in the lifetime. I can remember being so grateful when Dr. Bowen would say at one of the clinical conferences, "This takes a lifetime." And I say, "Oh, I'm so glad I've got one." Well, I have less of one now, and I'm getting really motivated to get some of it written. But I was thinking about Dr. Steve Porges' work. In his most, he's another creative scientist who's been able to look at the phenomenon and see it in a way none of his colleagues and peers were able to see when he defined the evolutionary perspective on the nervous system, and how much he integrated faces and checking faces as the first human response to stress. And I'll tell you quickly how he illustrated that to me. But Dr. Porges' study of the evolution of the nervous system was that the human addition to the phylogenetic heritage of parasympathetic response to stress, or a vagal response to the unmyelinated vagal response to stress that activates our gut and affects our fatigue and go to sleep response, is evolved to a level of sympathetic nervous system activity represented in vertebrates that give us the fight or flight addition to the collapse response of reptiles. And the human contribution was to hook up the myelinated vagal to the brain and to our checking faces to see if they're relaxed and smiley or if they're tense and uptight. And that our first response to stress is to check the social system. And so when people check faces, then if it's calm, the faces say, "It's all right." Or if the faces say, and you interpret them to say, "You're screwing up, you're in big trouble," then we shift into the next level of response. All this operating outside awareness, according to Steve Porges' perspective. And he illustrated that to me when he and Sidney Reed and I visited his office in Chicago to see if I really understood his thinking accurately, or if I was screwing it up. And so I said something to Dr. Porges, and he just growled at me with the biggest, he said something like, "You're really messing up with my theory," or something. And my first instinct was to check Sidney Reed's face. I immediately looked at my friend to see if she heard what I heard. I mean, I didn't even think about it. I looked at her. And she was as horrified as I was. And then Dr. Porges breaks into this great grin, and he says, "See, you just did it. Gotcha." Gotcha. And I know Dr. Kerr knows this science as well, if not better than I do, but there's so many ways that we are attuned to faces. And that was beautifully illustrated, I thought, in the tape today, and in the use that Dr. Kerr and Barbara Mager were making of the ability to observe facial responses and their impact then on function, the next level of function. And that's such a great example of science that's going on all the time. All the
That's a
time.
great example of a scientist who will not miss a chance to do it, too.
If I could just add one piece to that, going back to the discussion about autism, which, again, funding was available to study autism, and Steve Porges got some of it and went and studied it using this, what he calls the polyvagal theory. But he had a dramatic piece of video that he showed at a meeting in Washington, where these were, I guess you wouldn't call these kids hardcore autistic. I think they were more in the mid-range. And so he had films of them interacting before he did his intervention. And they had all the signs of autism, poor eye contact, hand flapping, and ritualistic things they were doing. And then he put these earphones on them that played a certain kind of music he had put together with certain kinds of notes, with the belief that this would activate the most recently evolved part of the vagal nerves that controlled the muscles to the face. It had a big influence on the muscles of the face and facial expression. And then, so the kids listened to this music, and while they were, I forget if it, while they were or after, but I think definitely while they were listening, they became incredibly animated and interactive with other kids, with their mothers, with the tester, the whole 9 yards. He called this a functional dysfunction. Didn't say for sure it was structural, but somehow it could be alleviated, at least temporarily, with this technique, which I thought posed a lot of interesting questions. What is autism, anyway? Well, where is the problem lying? To me, it spoke of anxiety.
Who was that again?
Well, this is the person Victoria was mentioning, Dr. Steve Porges, Porges. And if you Google him on the internet, there's just a wealth of information. Whether that video is on the internet, I don't know. But if you're interested in it, I'm sure he can point a direction. It's really powerful.
Actually, that videotape and his presentation of his thinking is on the family and the brain and integrated circuit, which was one of the spring meetings that was held at the Bowen Center in 2004. And some of those tapes are available for people who want to look at them again. I know we've got to stop.
At this time, thank you all for your ideas.